West Virginia Humanities Council presents Uncle Abner by Melville Davisson Post. The Mystery at Hillhouse. Read by Kyle Warmack. Part 1. Abner pulled up his horse and looked down at the sweep of country that fell away from the range of the Alleghanies westward toward the Ohio. It descended in the vast arc of a circle. The rim of the mountains bowed around it, a bench of the range making a sort of elevated plateau, wide and with but a slight descent. From this bench falling sharply away, the country sloped over long, steep, sodded fields to the river and meadow beyond. It is the oldest cattle country in America. For 100 years it has been fenced and pastured. The pioneer cleared it when the continent was young, when the territories west were a crown colony, when Virginia, in its indefinite, vast boundaries, was an empire, when the Allegheny Range was a sort of Chinese wall against the red hordes of the west. But it was no unclaimed land spotted with the squatter's patch. It was held from the earliest time in large tracts under grants from George. True, that Hanoverian king had only a paper title. It was the painted kings in their villages along the Ohio who had possession, and they were not to be ejected by any parchment warrant. Neither were the determined men who crossed the mountains from Maryland and Virginia to be dispossessed. Thus, for a decade, a barbarous war went on. It was a war unwritten and unremembered except in the brief memorial of some pioneer setting down what his father could recall at the end of his life, wrapped up by the fire. The Hanoverian king gave his grant and went his way, and the men who held his warrants depended on themselves. No redcoat crossed the ridge of the mountains to help them when the savage raided. They cleaned the forests and sodded down their fields and made the land. And when the time came, they rode north with George of Virginia against this English king. But they rode like feudal barons with their retainers and their independent spirit in them. These were the fathers, and the sons who came after them were not of weaker stuff. One must carry this history in his memory if he is to understand the land that lay before Abner on this October afternoon, and by that word I mean the men who held it, their sturdy independence, their direct methods, their impatience with the dilatory government of Virginia that was distant and hedged about with forms. The law was all well enough when there was time. But when there was no time, they acted swiftly and for themselves. They were not always right, but for that matter, neither is the law court. The judge's writ has taken away the orphan's inheritance and hanged its man by error and by perjury and by both, when every safeguard of human ingenuity has been thrown about it. And so, we must not hurry to condemn our fathers. They had to deal swiftly with the thief and the assassin. Nevertheless, at the time I write of, there were men here who saw a better way. I do not mean a dreamer or a weakling. I mean men like my Uncle Abner. You cannot understand this unless you understand the man. He was a crag of common sense, Randolph used to say, on which the opinions and theories of fools broke and went to pieces. He was big, with a face that might have been forged out by a smith. A grim, deeply religious man, like those who followed Cromwell. But he did not practice either sufferance or non-resistance to a wrong. Abner belonged to the church militant, and he was in the service of a warlord. It was a grazing country. The fat cattle were driven overland to Baltimore for market, across the mountain range of the Alleghanies into Maryland. Abner was returning from one of these long drives on this October afternoon. His men who had traveled with the cattle were scattered on the trails back, and he rode alone. His big chestnut horse was tired, and either that reason or something impressive in the vast sweep of the land suddenly uncovered before him caused the man to pull up in the road. Far below, where the road trailed out into the lowlands by the river, there was a whitewashed tavern, a spot in the sun, and beyond it, farther down the narrow valley, was Hillhouse, the manor that old Thorndike Patterson had builded at the foot of the long slope above the river. Abner was motionless and silent. The horse resting in the sun was like a bronze dyed with a dye. There was a thicket above the road, and now suddenly, with no warning sound, a man slipped out of this wood, crossed the rail fence, and stepped down into the road. The man, moving thus covertly as in some fear, did not see Abner until he was almost on the horse. He was a little lank man of the hills with a narrow face. He carried a bundle in a grist sack. Abner knew the man. He was a sort of tenant farmer, renting a bit of the Patterson land at its highest point on the bench of the mountains, a little meadow and a field. But he was in fact a trapper and in no good repute. His dogs disturbed the cattle, and the holes in the sodded hills that he dug out he did not refill. It was a source of constant quarrel with old Webster Patterson. The holes washed into gullies, and the two threatened one another. Abner's horse brought the man up shortly. "Jefferson," he said, "you travel blind like Balaam." The man was startled in his stride and hung a moment before he got his balance. Fear in the background of his face came out. I'm in a hurry, Abner," he replied. "I did not see you." "And why do you hurry?" said my uncle. "Have you so far to go?" "A long way," replied the man, "over the mountains into Maryland." "Into Maryland," repeated my uncle. "What takes you into Maryland?" The man did not at once reply. He looked about him at the empty road, at the long range of the mountains, at the fields below. His face lengthened, and there came a sort of whine into his voice. "What keeps me here, Abner?" he said. "The grazers do not like me, and if a thing happens, it is straightway laid down at my door. I'm charged with every petty misdemeanor. If lightning strikes a haystack, I have burned it. If a passing tramp sleeps in an empty barn loft and knocks out the ashes of his pipe, it is I who have set the building up in smoke. I alone, in this whole country, am supposed to travel in the night. All others are abed, honest men asleep. I am hounded, Abner, and I can no longer bear it. I have some feeling like other men, and in every direction there is only a scowling face. To every cattleman, I am a creature of the devil. My dogs disturb the cattle. I'm a trespasser, laying down their fences and leaving the gates to bang off their hinges in the wind." The man went on as though enamored of his words. "The landowner does not consider the good I do. I destroy the mink and the weasel that forage on his hen roosts, the polecat that eats the quail eggs, and the varmints that burrow in his pasture, but these benefits that I give are not regarded." He paused. "Tell me, Abner, how does the deadfall set along the ridges interfere with pasture? It cannot trap a steer. There is no wizardry in these hills that changes a bullock to a mink when the moon comes up. And yet if a steer is dead, it is I who have killed him. He eats the poisonous buckeye and he dies, and I in some manner have brought about his death, fed him some deadly herbage, or sprinkled the grass before his nose with arsenic. And if a horse goes lame from a twisted leg in a bog crossing, it is I who have ridden it in the night." My uncle looked steadily at the man. There was about his face the shadow of an ironical smile. "You forget, Jefferson," he said, "that the fat bullock is a gentleman, accustomed to his leisure, and not to be disturbed when he is sleeping in the night. No man regards your traps. But we will not have the pasture land dug up in holes, and we will not have the cattle maddened by a pack of dogs. On these counts the complaint against you is established. But not on the arson, and not on any poisoner charge. Why should you flee away as though you had done a murder?" The final sentence was an idle addendum to my uncle's words, but on the instant at them, the man went white. His mouth sagged, and moisture came out on his face. "Murder, Abner?" he faltered. "What do you know about murder?" My uncle laughed. "The raccoon, Jefferson," he replied, "is not a citizen of Virginia, and no writ runs against his premeditated killing. You cannot be haled into the circuit court on that. But your explanation of your exodus does not convince me." He extended his arm and pointed toward the little farm on the narrow plateau above the Patterson lands. "You have a house there, some goods, some utensils, a cow perhaps, and some farm equipment, and I find you here with clothing in a sack. A householder does not emigrate into Maryland in this fashion. What is the truth about this matter?" The man covered his weak mouth with his hand. His face took on a sort of childish simplicity. "Abner," he said, moving his hand upward over his face, "all men trust you, and I trust you too. "A thing has happened, and I am afraid." Anyone could see that the creature had come finally to his real motive. My uncle brought his clenched hand down on the pommel of his saddle. His voice hardened, sharpened, and lifted out of its casual note. "My friend," he said, "that is the worst reason in the world. A man cannot flee from fear. From any other thing he may flee away if it seems expedient, but on fear, under no conditions can he turn his back. He must face fear. Fear is the challenge to our courage, and courage, Jefferson, is the greatest thing we have. When it goes, there is nothing left worth the distinguishing definition of a man. Honor, justice, even righteousness itself are all based on courage. If you are on your way from fear, you must go back and face it." "But Abner," the man whined, "how can I face it?" "How can you not face it?" replied my uncle, "even be it murder. Guilty or innocent, there is no other way. If we face up to the things we fear, even to the gallows, we have somehow the respect of men. But every human creature loathes a coward, and there is no solution in a flight. It is the abandonment of one's manhood to the pit." "But Abner," the man's voice was in a whisper, "you do not know the dreadful thing behind me." "No matter," replied my uncle. "The thing before you is a worse thing. A man can be hanged and bear it, but he cannot be crucified by his own contempt. No matter what you fear, you cannot be worse off than Saul. Abandoned by God and doomed by Samuel, he put his armor on and went up, with his trumpets blowing, to a battle that he could not win." The man standing in the road looked up. Something dawned vaguely in his face. "Will you stand behind me, Abner, if I go back?" he said. "And if I do not," replied my uncle, "you will have the greater gain of standing behind yourself." The man hesitated a moment, searching my uncle's face. Then he turned away. Abner watched the man climb the ancient rail fence, matted with yellow vines, and return, as he had come, along the bench of the mountains toward his house. It sat in a field in a bit of meadow above the Patterson lands. He had rented the few poor acres from old Webster Patterson some years before, and by reason of indefinite words written in the lease, Patterson could not now eject him for all their bitter quarrels. Abner spoke to his horse and rode slowly on. But he rode now in a deep reflection. To what end did the tireless energies of God concern themselves, and of what moment were the tragedies of men? They came and passed, were born and stepped into eternity. Few and evil, as the third patriarch said it, usually were the days of a life, and they vanished clear away. The dim record of their succession was even here in this land comparatively new. What trace remained of the pioneer's cabin and the pioneer? A little heap of stones where the chimney had finally fallen. And before the pioneer, the red man, already a legend. And before that painted nomad, another race, of which not even a legend remained. Only their burial mounds on this high plateau of the range, paved with flat stones, under which their bones had disintegrated. They also, in this scriptural language, had vanished clear away, leaving only these mounds of sepulchre and some fanciful wild tales imagined by their successors. Apt and descriptive was the book of Job. Like a song, like a shadow on a wall, were the whole race of men. Of what moment were their little tragedies? How they came and how they passed? Whether one went swiftly and in violence, or slowly in one's bed, did it matter? The thing that mattered was what the soul of man took with him on his way, and the only thing he could take was the form into which this inexplicable environment shaped his soul. He rode on. Below, the long highway wound down like a yellow ribbon. The world lay peaceful in the sun, as in the silence of a benediction. The great red horse, stained with sweat, moved slowly under his master, who sat with his big plowshare jaw bedded into his collar. They descended into a ravine of the mountain and came out into a drove of cattle. The first bullock appeared on a little rise of the road, regarded them with a sort of peaceful intent, and was joined by another. Abner pulled up by the roadside for the drove to pass. He knew the cattle. They belonged to old Webster Patterson, 60 young steers that the eccentric old man had held to autumn, refusing to sell them to the traders who bought in the field and drove overland to Baltimore. A dog, with a great air of competence, kept a few bullocks moving in the front of the drove, and by reason of the dog, Abner knew that the purchaser came from beyond the mountains. A dog was not a cattle driver in this westward portion of Virginia. The fat steer in this land was like the sacred bulls of Egypt, to be moved gently and at his leisure. A dog was too impatient of delay, and would not always regard the rule, the median rule that suffered no amendment. Too slowly the fat steer cannot be driven. The cattle sauntered past, and the purchaser with another dog appeared. He was on foot, and white with dust. He was a stranger to my uncle, but he was a stranger that one regarded. He was a big, black-bearded man with the shoulders of an ox, a barrel chest, and fingers like the coupling pins of a cart. Builded to pull down pillars or to grind blinded at a Philistine mill was the fancy that my uncle got. Abner spoke to the man, with the usual salutation to the stranger on a road. The man nodded and trudged on, but my uncle stopped him. "You have bought the Patterson cattle," he said. "I have," replied the man. He stopped now and faced Abner squarely, his heavy shoulders forward, as in a sort of menace, as though he held the road and held his position in it. Held it as with a challenge. The manner, too, of the man was surly, as though he would not be questioned and would not be stopped. There was no courteous aspect about the man. "They are well-shaped young cattle. Kept over for another year, they will average 1,500, but they are light for Baltimore. Are you from Maryland?" "I am," replied the man, but in no pleasant humor. My uncle did not regard this manner. He spoke as to the usual stranger on the road. "You travel alone," he said. "I do," replied the man. "I came over the mountain alone, I go back alone, and at no man's permission." "You took some chance, then," said Abner. "Webster Patterson would sell only for the money in his hand, and you must have carried the money. Were you not afraid?" The big man lifted his shoulders. He squared his body in the road. "Afraid," he echoed. "Of what should I be afraid?" "A fine thing, courage," was Abner's comment. "I put it in near the top of all earthly excellence. But there are some forms of courage that take a higher merit than other forms." He paused. "A moral courage, for example, that takes one back to face a thing of danger from which one has well escaped, would be, I think, the highest form." The man's eyes shifted a bit, as though uncertain of my uncle's meaning. "What are you driving at?" he said, chopping the words off under his thick beard. "This only," continued my uncle, "that as a man of courage and unafraid, would you return of your own will into danger from which you could escape by flight, if no man compelled you, and you could do as you pleased about it?" The man did not at once reply. He looked at the far-off valley from which he had come up, at the cattle moving forward before the dog, and then up at my uncle, and his surly manner advanced into a menace. "I would do as I pleased about it," he said. "And as for you, sir," and though he did not move, he seemed to advance against my uncle, "you can ride on to the devil. I will not be stopped and questioned." He strode after the drove of cattle, swaggering in the road as though it were a king's highway that his prowess had preempted. Abner watched him disappear into the ravine that obscured the road. Evening was on the way. It would be dark before the cattle traveled halfway to the summit of the mountain. One must carry in the mind the long distance from the ridge of the range to the valley. It was well into the afternoon when my uncle came out on the summit of the mountain at the gap where it crossed toward Maryland. And now, half on the way down, the sun was moving into the west and long shadows were beginning to appear. The horse traveled slowly, and seemed by this leisure gait to regain the reserve of strength that it had expended on the journey. Abner seemed again lost in a deep reflection, and the horse had its idle way. There was time aplenty. Night would bring them to the tavern in the valley. One could see it, a splotch of white in the shadows. The road was not always clear to the eye except at certain turns and angles of it. It would be hidden over long distances by the shoulders of the hills. They went on. The afternoon lengthened and drew on to evening. The temperature of the air began to change, the shadows to crowd in. There had been no sound in the world but the hum of the autumn insect, the chatter of the squirrel or the far-off hammering of a woodpecker on a dead chestnut limb. But now below, some distance on the road, there was the sound of horses, and emerging from one of the long hollows into which the road wound, Abner saw a company of men coming up from the valley. The thing brought my uncle up sharply in the saddle. He became on the instant alert and vital. His introspection slipped off like a garment. He pulled up the horse and stopped. But it was not beside the road, as with the cattle, that he stopped. It was squarely in the middle of the road, as though he held it. And there in the middle of the road he waited. He had changed. He was now a resolute, determined figure, grim-faced and silent. Abner knew the men. They were cattle grazers of the hills, and he divined the mission they were on, but he was puzzled at the leader. He was not a man that such a company would select to lead, a little trader of no particular standing in the county, and with a decidedly doubtful past. He bought and sold the cattle refuse of the hills, cows and heifers. Sylvester Dix had been concerned with more than one questionable venture. He pulled up in the road before my uncle. "Abner," said Dix, "did you pass a drove of cattle?" "I did," replied my uncle, but he was looking beyond Dix to the men behind him. Dix drove his heel into his horse. "Come on," he said. "There's time to get our man before the night falls." But my uncle turned his horse against the road. "Dix," he said, "what is this venture that you are on?" "This, Abner," he said, "if you do not know it, Webster Patterson has been killed and robbed, and we have raised the country to overtake his assassin and bring him back." "This is grave news," replied my uncle. "Do you know who this assassin is?" "We do," said Dix. "It's the man from Maryland with the cattle." "And how do you know it?" said Abner. "I'll tell you," replied the man, "and you'll see precisely how we know. We found Webster Patterson dead in the orchard by his house, his pocketbook rifled, and his cattle gone. This is what happened. A stranger with 2 dogs came in from Maryland, a big, surly creature. He inquired for a drove of good light steers and was sent on to Patterson. He trades with Patterson for cattle by the head, pays Patterson down in cash, turns the cattle into the road with the dogs to hold them, comes back to the house, kills Patterson, retakes the money he has paid, and hurries the cattle over the mountains before he's apprehended." Abner's face was grave. "Who saw all this?" he said. "I saw it," continued Dix. "I was on the road with a bunch of heifers. From a rise in the road I saw the cattle, the stranger, and his dogs, and I saw old Webster Patterson going into the orchard from his house. I came on. The Fairfax wood shut out the view from me, but some half-hour later, when I came up to the house, I saw old Webster lying in the orchard. I got off, and I went to him, and he was dead. There was a maul near him. The whole back of his head had been crushed in with the maul. I carried him into the house. On the way, as his coat was open, his pocketbook dropped out. There was no money in it. Here it is, you can see for yourself." He produced the pocketbook and opened it on the pommel of his saddle. My uncle looked hard at the man. "Dix," he said, "you make a case against yourself. Webster Patterson is killed, and you come here with his empty pocketbook." The man's face changed. "A case against myself," he echoed. "That is it," continued Abner. "A case against yourself. You know of this cattle sale, you see the cattle in the road, and you know the money has been paid down in cash, for it is the custom with a stranger. You come on, you find old Webster Patterson in the orchard, you engage him in talk, and while he is not looking, strike him from behind. You rob the body, and then raise a posse comitatus on your own authority to arrest a stranger for the murder." Abner lifted his great body in the saddle. "Dix," he said, "you have gone too far. This empty pocketbook would hang you. Why did you bring this pocketbook to prove, sir, that you had robbed the body of your victim?" The man's slack face went white. It fell out of the dead man's pocket," he stuttered. It fell out. There was no money in it." "No money in it," repeated Abner. "And why, sir, should we believe that on your word? Is your word so good? Have you taken such care to stand behind it? Is there a man here who would sell you a bullock on your word or trust you for $1 on it?" Abner laughed. There was a dry, hard irony in the laugh. "Dix," he cried, "you are riding toward the gallows, and you are carrying a rope to hang you." And at the drive of the words the appalled creature went to pieces. Fear overcame him. He lashed his horse and dashed past my uncle in mortal terror. Abner turned. His horse was swifter, and he overtook the man. He caught the rein of the bridle and pulled him up. "Dix," he said, "you are a fool. Will you also be a coward? Do you want the world to believe you guilty? Flight is confession, don't you see that? If you run away, there is no jury in the hills that will believe you." He held the horse firmly with his big hand and pulled the shaken man together. You do not believe me, Abner," the creature stuttered, "and who will believe me?" "And what of that?" replied my uncle. "If you have the courage for a crime, have also the courage to face what follows after it. If you are innocent of murder, why should you convict yourself by fear? There is no gain in fear. Get your courage in your teeth, Dix, and ride back." The others had come on. The motive in the little company had turned about like a weather vane. They would now take Dix into custody for the murder, but they had cooled off. They had excuse for these swift reprisals. The law was slow, and along this range cattle were stolen and run over the border into Maryland. The thing had become an intolerable outrage and no longer to be borne. The land was on its feet against it. This murder had been a flame to hemp. From one point of view, the case against the stranger was conclusive. But here, from Abner's words, was a view from another quarter. They were no longer certain, and in this changed mood my uncle had his will with them. They should return and leave this thing to him. The man with the Patterson cattle could not get over the state line for a day. Dix should wait a legal inquiry. And so for all their tragic purpose they turned out into the crossroads, and my uncle went on toward the tavern, dimly outlined in the twilight. But before he continued on with his journey, my uncle called Dix back and gave him a verbal message to take on to the stranger with the cattle. Dix should ride alone, and say only the precise words in the message that my uncle sent. It seemed a curious thing to send Dix of all the company on such a mission. But on the other hand, was he not more certain than any other, in his present changed mood, to do precisely what Abner told him? At any rate, it pleased my uncle to select him. Since he rode so hard to overtake this stranger, he should ride to a proper purpose. Abner went on. His meeting with the trapper on the mountain and the big cattle driver took now a different aspect. Their words, their incidental acts, had now an indicatory significance. Or they were, in the light of what he now knew, capable of that construction. Looked at by a grand jury in an inquisitorial setting, these acts were signboards conspicuous with meaning. The hurried flight of the fur trapper, his fear, his significant sentence on the dreadful thing behind him, emerged into a broader field. Abner had now a higher feeling for the courage of the man. It was then from no verbal quarrel with old Webster Patterson that the creature fled. But in what manner was he complicated in this tragedy? And what of the big surly stranger? Surely his manner was against him, and he had the physical structure for the deed as Dix had so vividly described it. With a maul for a weapon, this man could fell an ox. Was he, in fact, the assassin and the robber? It would be the simple elements of crime to pay down his money and recover it with a blow. And yet his arrow at a venture against Dix might have reached the bullseye. He had loosed that arrow with another purpose. The law and the orderly procedure of the law must be strengthened. The land was running into violence. The direct action of angered persons would presently supersede the law. Men would be judged and punished in hot blood, and all the orderly procedure of government would go to pieces. It were better for the guilty to go free than to put the land in chaos. And so my uncle had set his face against it. And so he had driven the implications of the crime on Dix with all the force he could, to confound the posse and lay the guilt on the leader of it. He had gone about that work with no gentle hand, and to his wonder he had succeeded beyond all conjecture. Panic had enveloped Dix. It had taken all the persuasion he could manage to get the shaken creature to await the orderly procedure of the law. Was the man in fact guilty? Had the count of his verbal indictment set out the truth? His influence on the illegal posse comitatus was no great wonder. Men taking the law into their hands fall into confusion at a doubt. And Abner's word in this land was taken always for a thing accomplished. At his word, they had left this thing to him. The obligations of it were now on him. He must consider the items of that obligation. He must clear the mystery of this crime, and he must find the man who did it. 2 acts were indicated. He must stop the stranger with the cattle before noon tomorrow, and he must send for Randolph. In this latter need, chance favored him. When he came out from a bend of the road before the tavern, he saw Randolph's gig. The Negro driver was standing beside the horse. Abner got down before the door, gave his own horse into the care of Randolph's driver, and went in. The little tavern sat fronting on the highway, A covered porch extended its full length. It was neat and whitewashed, even the fences running on either side were white. The tavern-keeper was an invalid, bedridden in an upper room, but the energy of his eccentric wife was enough for two. She was a conspicuous figure in the hills. Her tongue ran, and she knew every variety of gossip. But for all her words, in the remote recesses of her she was a person of sound common sense. Her comment on events was shrewd, except when those events could be garnished with some supernatural fancy. Signs concerned her. She tapped on wood to appease the witches, she nailed up a horseshoe for good luck, and she crossed her fingers and made the usual sign when the salt spilled on her table. All the fancies attendant on the dead disturbed her, what the dying said, and the prophetic words of those in the senility of age. The woman half believed that the paralytic condition of her husband had been affected by an evil eye, or the sorcery of some enemy's incantation. There was a fire burning on the hearth when my uncle entered, for there is a chill in this land at autumn, when the sun goes down beyond the great wall of the hills. Randolph stood before this fire, his hands spread out to the flame. He was the justice of the peace, a neighbor to Abner, and a gentleman. You are not to think of him as a justice of our modern time. The office of justice of the peace in that day, in Virginia, followed the English manner. The idea of it was inherited from the English law. The king, to keep his peace, selected the most influential men in his counties for this office. Virginia, with some like vague intent, continued to select such men. And under this large conception, it was an office of no little honor. At this time, and even beyond the mountains to the west, it was so regarded. Only a landowner and a gentleman would hold it. We have traveled far since then. I have said that Randolph was a neighbor and a friend to Abner. Their lands adjoined, and my uncle held him, for his qualities of a man, in high regard. But his mannerisms were the annoyance of my uncle's life. He was vain and pompous, and enamored with the extravagance of words. But he was a gentleman beneath it, and the impulses from which he acted were those of a man of honor. He turned as my uncle entered. "Abner!" he cried. "By the eternal, I am glad to see you. Did you by any chance come on a posse comitatus?" "I did," replied my uncle, "and I turned it back." "You did right," said Randolph. "It had no authority to act. It came together at no call from me. It rode outside the law. It was a mob. Its arrests would have been illegal. Any citizen apprehended by it could have resisted with a weapon in his hand. Who led it?" "It had the very strangest leader," replied my uncle. "Sylvester Dix." Randolph swore, snapping his finger above the fire. "A pretty gentleman to enforce the law. Sylvester Dix, a crooked traitor and a drunken lout." He fingered the bunch of seals attached to the big watch in his pocket. "When the people rush in before the law, it is always such vermin who go first, loud-mouthed and blatant and swaggering in their saddles. I drove hard, Abner, to get here before him, and if I had arrived on time, I would have flayed his hide. Sylvester Dix to usurp the legal procedure of Virginia!" And in his disgust he stamped the hearthstones. "It was not this stranger from Maryland who killed and robbed old Webster Patterson. It's clear to any legal mind who did it. But if this cattle buyer from the East were the guilty one, it is not for a mob to bring him back. Virginia is not yet so feeble that she requires the aid of Dix, or that she must send a company on horse to take up a man without a warrant." He ran on, stimulating himself into a fury. He was dressed with some elegance after the manner of the time. He had been educated beyond the mountains. He had a great estate in lands. He lived like the gentry of a somewhat earlier day, and on the westward side of the Alleghanies he had come to consider himself as a sort of ambassadorial figure, representing in his person the sovereign dignity of Virginia. "I will sit tomorrow," he said when he had gotten back his judicial calm, "determine this assassin and hold him for the circuit court. The case is clear." Abner came over to the fire and sat down in one of the high-backed splint-bottomed chairs. He made no comment on this speech, and Randolph continued with his discourse. "This will be the doing of old Calhoun Patterson." My uncle looked up at that. "Calhoun Patterson," he said. "Was he with Webster at the time?" This was another light on the complicated mystery. "He was," said Randolph. "He had ridden over in the morning, and he was there all day. There is no mystery about it. Calhoun Patterson did this murder." He paused and fingered the gold seals about his waistcoat. "I should not make so definite a pronouncement," he went on, "if I were to sit tomorrow as a court of final determination. But I sit only as a court of inquiry, to send the whole case on to the inquisitorial investigation of the grand jury and to the circuit court. I do not determine guilt. I hold only on probable cause, and my finding entails no penal sentence. I therefore speak with a larger liberty than a circuit judge in the same position." My uncle was in deep reflection. If Calhoun Patterson had been present on this day, then the whole tragic mystery shifted to another angle. How could the man from Maryland, or Dix, or the trapper from the mountain dare to go about a murder with his witness in the environs of the place? This added information deepened the puzzle. Abner knew Calhoun Patterson, the details of his life, and all about his relations with his brother. It was the story of a bitter hatred, that blood hatred in some family quarrels. The father, old Thorndyke Patterson, after the death of Calhoun's mother, had taken a second wife. It was a marriage out of his class. The new wife was from the far south, and not to be definitely placed, an octoroon woman from New Orleans, the county gossips said. From this marriage, Webster Patterson was born. There was only a year or two of difference between the sons, for the first wife died at Calhoun's birth, and the second was brought in within the year. But while the difference in age was slight, the difference in feeling between the two men was widely variant. Calhoun considered himself outside the social status of his brother, of a different and more elevated class. The first wife had been of a good Virginia family, and the second tainted. A Creole, Thorndyke said when he brought the new wife in. An octoroon, the county dubbed her. There was a difference, too, in the inherent natures of the men. Calhoun was outspoken and above board with what he had to say. There was little circumlocution in the man. Where he stood was never at any time in doubt. Webster was the reverse of this, crafty and diplomatic, with an eye to gain, and out of these motives he courted the favor of his father. As age weakened the old man, Webster's influence controlled him. He made a will, leaving his estate to Webster for his life, and after that son's death, to Calhoun. Webster had given this disposition a sort of honorable intent. There was his mother to take care of, and the manor house and lands should remain together in one hand, while the woman lived, and not be split up and divided, with no home for her to sit in when the feebleness of age grew on her. For himself he did not care. After this, as he pretended, Calhoun could have the whole estate. He wished it only for his life, that was to say, for the term, only of his mother's comfort. But the county was not convinced, and Calhoun condemned the pious pretension in the plainest language. He went to live at some little distance on a bit of property from his own mother's family. But he came back to the Patterson mansion when he pleased and loitered about it as he liked, with the freedom of a sharer in it. To this habit in Calhoun, Webster gave no concern. He ignored the man and went about his own affairs. He had gotten what he wanted, and if the price were this annoyance, he would not disturb himself about it. Nor was he to be disturbed at what Calhoun gossiped and threatened in his drunken talk. With a certain vision, he saw that the very extravagance and persistence of this talk would finally denude it of any influence. He was right in this conception. The habits of Calhoun aided to this end. As the man grew older, he took to the common vice, and now, at the approach of his age, he was rarely sober. But for all this, the county respected Calhoun above his brother. The man did not lie. He was honorable in his small affairs, and he said out frankly what he thought. Webster, as I have written, was the reverse of this. There was always some covert intent, to his own advantage, in what he did. He was penurious and hard-handed in his trades. His manner and his words were always a pretension, and he respected and regarded nothing. The county knew Webster Patterson for what he was. Sometimes, perhaps, they did him an injustice. For example, when the manor burned, there was not lacking one to say that Webster lighted it and put it out when the damage to the portico and front would not exceed the insurance to replace it. And the source of some of the materials for that repair remained in the public memory as a sort of practical looting of the dead. Thus the history of the family ran. The old octoroon woman entered into age and died. Webster lived on in his pretensions, and Calhoun drunken and more voluble in his threats against him. All this passed through my uncle's memory while the justice talked. Was Randolph by chance right in this conjecture? Had old Calhoun finally come to the point of acting on his threat? The conclusion was not outside of one's experience. A threat to do a deed, long weakened by idle repetition, was sometimes, in the heat of sudden provocation, carried out. But the theory had certain phases that were not convincing. The robbery of the body was the main point. That fact stood out. It was the prime indicatory fact pointing to the others in this affair. It would be the moving motive in this man from Maryland and Dix, if either were in fact the criminal agent. It would not be the motive in the trapper if he were behind the thing. This tenant farmer on the bench of the mountain above the Patterson lands would have a cause, rather, in his verbal clashes with old Webster. The ill will between the two of them was known. Abner required no confession out of the trapper's conversation to establish this. It was the common knowledge of the countryside. Webster had been white-heated into an evil humor when he found that the words of limitation in his lease would not permit him to eject the tenant from the house, the little meadow and the field, where his estate extending over the bench of the mountain ran to the line. He would not pay for a legal paper, so he wrote the lease himself. And, from ignorance of the legal construction of his terms, he gave the man an extended freehold that he could not revoke. This discovery put him in a fury, and the two, violent in their language, did not meet without a fishwife's quarrel. It was the comedy of the countryside. There was motive here. But the main fact, pronounced by Randolph, stood in the way. If Calhoun Patterson had been present on the day of Webster's murder, did not that fact put a conjectural case against these other persons out of court? Who could go about such an assassination before a witness? It would be the extremity of folly to take such a chance even if the witness were not, for the actual moment, visible. He could not be far away. He might appear out of the house or from some quarter at any time. It was a hazard too dangerous to be taken by anyone in reason. This would exclude Dix and the man from Maryland. But would it necessarily exclude the trapper? He would be acting in hot blood if he were the guilty agent, and hot blood did not act in reason. But if so, how could old Calhoun fail to have knowledge of the thing if he were idling about the place? Randolph was in the swing of his speech while my uncle was in this reflection, and his next sentence tumbled the fabric of these probabilities into chaos. Calhoun was drunk when he arrived, and he got more liquor in him as the day advanced. He had come by Ephraim Dilworth's still, so his supply was ample. He was more in liquor then than was customary with him, and therefore more determined in his purpose. He was on his way to kill Webster Patterson, he told Dilworth, when he stopped for a supply of liquor. But as the threat was in the usual tenor of his talk, Dilworth gave it no attention. In this conclusion, Dilworth was in error. Calhoun meant precisely what he said. Randolph went on. I hold the early English judges in a high regard, and it was their belief that if a man contemplated a criminal act over a great length of time, finally in the end he was pretty certain to accomplish it. Therefore, in their criminal trials, they admitted evidence of threats and a long-standing hostile intent against the victim. He paused and assumed a judicial air. I do not maintain, as one having some knowledge of the law, that such evidence is in any sense conclusive, or attains to that degree of certainty that would justify a verdict of guilty on it. I would consider it merely as persuasive. I would, of course, require further evidence, proof of the corpus delicti, that is to say, in fact, the crime, and some evidence, direct or strongly circumstantial, connecting the accused with the criminal act. This would make up the case if I were sitting on our circuit bench. He made a little gesture as of one who dismissed a pleasing fancy. But before me, on probable cause, as in my court tomorrow, I would consider the motive, the opportunity, and this hostile intent, as evidenced by the accused's threats, over a long period of time, as making a conclusive case. But my uncle was not listening to this discourse. If Calhoun Patterson was drunk, the whole affair swung back to its early status. There was no menace to the assassin in a drunken man stretched out on a bed or heaped up in a corner. There might, in fact, be some gain in it. The assassin could make the argument which he had just considered, and at the worst, sober or drunken, a third person was a straw man for the defense, a device to split up suspicion. The tragic mystery stood precisely where it was. On an autumn morning, in his orchard, in plain view of anyone who might happen to appear, with his brother about the house, Webster Patterson had been killed and robbed. Some $3,000 received from the sale of his cattle had been taken. He had been struck down by a blow that crushed in the skull. The weapon, evidently used for that murderous assault, lay near him, an ordinary hickory maul. There was no eyewitness to the deed, for all the open space in which the things had been accomplished. Or at least, there was no eyewitness that would admit such knowledge. There was circumstantial evidence, but these evidential signs took their virtue from the drift of the theory in which they were considered. As one believed, so were these signs capable of interpretation. The great crushing blow would indicate the ox-shouldered stranger. The empty pocketbook in question would fix the crime on Dix, and robbery as motive would fit either one. Quarrels and bad blood made up a case against the trapper. And here was old Calhoun, with every motive, come, as he declared, to do the thing himself. As one got deeper in contemplation of this mystery, one got more confused. The thing turned backward on itself like intriguing and vicious circles that fell one into the other, with no point of beginning and no end. A Janus with a different face toward every observer that approached it. The tavern keeper's wife came in to lay the table and put on the supper, and while she was about that work, she talked. "I knew something awful would happen to old Webster," she began. "Why?" said Randolph. "Well," the woman continued, "you can't rob the dead and get away with it. I suppose old Webster thought dead men could not hurt him. There's a fool thing to think. You know what a live man can do. You are in the dark with a dead man. Nobody can protect himself from a dead man." "What are you talking about?" said Randolph. "I mean the ancient people on the mountain," the woman went on. "Old Webster was crazy to violate their grave. Nobody with any sense would have dug into the burial mound of the ancient people and carted off the flat stones over their graves to pave his portico." Randolph understood then what the woman meant. It was a half-forgotten scandal kept in memory by the superstitions of the time. When Webster Patterson came to rebuild the front of Hill House after the fire, he had brought down the flat stones from a burial mound of the ancient race that had inhabited this land in prehistoric times. The floors of these mounds within were laid over with flat stones. Webster had opened the great one on the bench of the mountain above his land, and used the flat stones to replace the tiles of the portico, cracked in the fire. Randolph made a quick, deprecatory gesture. "You talk like a fool," he said. "The dead had nothing to do with ejecting Webster Patterson out of life." "Maybe so, Squire," continued the woman, "and maybe not. How does anybody know what the dead can do? It's terrible business to make the dead mad at you. I wouldn't like to rile the dead. You can see a living man coming to kill you, but you can't see a dead one coming. I don't know anything about how old Webster was killed. I don't know what happened, but I know what his old mother said would happen." "And what did she say would happen?" said Randolph, in the mock solemnity of one speaking to a child. "She went on terrible when Webster brought down the flagstones, cried and wrung her hands. She said something awful would happen to Webster. She didn't know what it was then, but when she was dying she knew what it was. The dying can see what's going to happen, and she saw it. The doctor said it was the delirium of death, but a doctor don't know everything." The woman was warming to the memory, and her tongue ran. "Of course, you can never get the straight of a thing like that. Everybody puts something to it. I wasn't there. There was nobody there but Webster, the doctor, and Calhoun, but the thing leaked out. Such things always leak out. The old octoroon woman was wrapped up in a chair by the fire. You're always cold when you're dying. And she kept screaming out about what she saw, about the awful thing that would happen to Webster. The doctor couldn't stop her. They had to hold her in the chair." But Randolph's patience had reached the end. "Shut up," he said. "It's an old housewife's tale, empty and idle." The woman turned about to my uncle, silent by the fire. "You know the Scriptures, Abner," she said. "There are lots of stranger things written in the Scriptures." "Yes, Matilda," he replied in his even, level voice. "There are stranger things written in the Scriptures." He looked through the window pane. It was dark. The heavens were overcast. No star was out. But 4 lights were visible. A candle at a window in the trapper's house, a gleam in the manor in the valley, another to the west where the trader lived, and a fire halfway up the mountain road where the man from Maryland camped out with his cattle. 4 lights burning in a darkened world. By which one of these did the murderer sit, fearful of the morning?